All right, looks like we're live. Just wait for things to catch up here. Well, thank you everybody for coming to the youth program of the Celebration of Nature. We have some really excellent presentations for you today. And I will let Maheshi go first with her presentation on European starlings.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really excited to talk to you about European starlings and about my research on their song. So I'm going to get started by first introducing myself. My name is Maheshi Dharmasuri. I'm a master's student in the Barber Lab at St. Mary's University. My supervisor is Dr. Colleen Barber, who's actually also here with us today, and she'll be able to answer some questions at the end of my presentation as well. She's a professor in the Department of Biology at St. Mary's University, and her research focuses...
Maheshi, I don't mean to interrupt, but it looks like the video might be a little bit lagging and frozen, so I'll just wait for that to catch up.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's no problem.
And whoever is watching, if you could let us know if it starts to buffer or you can't hear anything on your end, just feel free to let us know in the chat, and then we can wait for it to catch up.
It seemed fine on this end.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah, I didn't get any buffering or anything.
Oh, okay.
Or lagging, freezing.
That's good. Okay, so then I think we'll just go back to that. Carry on, Maheshi.
Okay, thank you. Let me know if I need to stop again. It's no problem. So as I was saying, Dr. Barber's research focuses on mate choice, sexual selection, parental investment, and avian conservation. She studies European starlings, but she has studied a variety of other birds as well. And Dr. Barber's specific research, I am focusing on male song in European starlings, which I'll touch on a little bit later in the presentation. To start off with, I thought I would tell you a little bit about how starlings were introduced to North America, and it was by Shakespeare enthusiasts. It's actually a specific individual who is called Eugene, who actually wanted to introduce every species that was mentioned in Shakespeare works to North America. And he decided to release 60 starlings in Central Park, New York in the 1890s. And that's how we have starlings in North America today. I think there's about 22 million birds, but their populations are declining quite drastically, both in North America, but also in their native ranges in Europe. So just to show you a map of where you can find starlings, I took this map from eBirds, which I actually recommend if you love birds and love bird watching to download it and put your information in there whenever you spot a bird. It's driven by citizen science, where individuals, when they spotted a European starling, they inputted the data. So all the purple areas in this map is where a European starling was spotted. And as you can see, in North America, they're found from the East Coast to the West Coast, and in Europe, where their native ranges are, you can find them pretty much throughout Europe, and they're found on all continents. So you can see that across the map. So for how would you identify a starling? So I thought I'd give you some characteristics to look out for when you see one. So they actually have two types of plumage, one when they're a breeding adult and one when they're non-breeding. So the one here on the left here is what you can find right now. If you look outside, this is how starlings would look now. They're in their breeding plumage. They're darker and their bills are yellower. And overall, in both the breeding and non-breeding, they're a chunky bird, about the size of a blackbird with a short tail, and they have beautiful iridescent feathers. But one of the main characteristics that is different when they're non-breeding is the white tips that they develop. Here on the right photo, you can see that they develop white tips, almost like spots at the end of their feathers, and their beak is not as yellow and it's darker. So these are two characteristics that change where you can identify them in the fall and winter, but they versus from around March to July where they have the breeding plumage. So for anyone who loves to go out and use their binoculars to look at birds, there's two ways that you can actually distinguish a male and a female, but with binoculars, the way we do it in the field is by looking at their beak color, so the base of the beak. So for a female, it's light pinkish in color, and in males, it's bluish, dark bluish in color. And another method that we use in the field when we are banding the individuals is their iris ring. So in females, there's a presence of an iris ring, which is yellowish, light brownish in color. And in males, you're not able to see this iris ring because it's completely brown. So their eye color looks uniformly brown. Presence of an iris. So that's two ways that you can distinguish a male and a females, and there's a bit of a learning curve with the binoculars looking at the beak color, but I definitely encourage light brownish and check it out. European starlings are urban species. You see them all around the city. I'm sure you've seen them in your back garden, and they're known as cavity nesting species. So they nest in holes of roofs. If you put out a nest box, they would nest in those, in old trees and cavities, and even in traffic light poles. So keep an eye out. I'm sure if you are walking and there's a traffic light nearby, you can check out to see if you see starling activity nearby. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about nesting material. Their nests are built both by the male and the female, and when we're doing our field work, we find interesting material in there. There's tons of feathers that are lined in the nest, and sometimes we find plastic, cigarette butts, wood scrapings. I'm not entirely sure the purpose of why they put lots of plastic in there, but we do find it. And also the males specifically incorporate a lot of greenery into their nests. So we find blades of grass, pine needles, lichen, dandelion flowers sometimes. And there's several hypotheses put forward to why they might do this. It could be from mate attraction to deter mites or parasites in the nests that feed on the adults and the nestlings. A little bit about their breeding. They can have up to 2 broods. So a brood being a group of young or nestlings. So their first brood is from April to May, and their second one is June to July. And on average, they have 3 to 4 eggs, but they can have a clutch size of 3 to 7 eggs. And they're this beautiful light blue coloration that you can see in this picture. And both the male and the female contribute to incubating the eggs or keeping them warm, as well as feeding the nestlings once they hatch. So this is a photograph that I took of a female, a mom sitting on their eggs, and they incubate both the male and the female on average incubate the eggs for about 12 days, and they hatch about 12 days after the second to last egg was laid. And this is a freshly hatched nestling. You can see their hairs are still wet and the piece of the shell is stuck to their skin. And I thought I would share a quick video with you of a nestling actually hatching, which is pretty cool. So that was a nestling that was just hatching. They were kind of pipping through the egg to get themselves out of the shell, which is actually pretty amazing. So I thought I'd share a quick form of important parent-offspring communication. Just like when I was young, or when you're hungry, you try to tell your parents that you're hungry, and this begging is a form that nestlings use to convey their need to their parents, and has both sound or acoustic and visual signals where their beaks are wide open, their necks are stretched out, and they're occasionally fighting, kind of competing with their siblings to get to the food. And it's an important way that they communicate with their parents when they're hungry or they need something. They what do starlings eat? So they primarily feed on invertebrates. So you could find them feeding on earthworms and other insects as well. But they're also opportunistic scavengers. They thrive in cities, and we've often seen them feasting on sausages and feeding their offspring with pizza. So they definitely take advantage of what's around them and feed their nestlings. So in one time, I even saw them having a great time feeding their nestlings with poutine that was on the pavement that had fallen down. So fledging. So fledging is when nestlings have developed the ability to fly and leave the nest. And in starlings, the nestlings fledge about 20 to 23 days after they have hatched. They're not completely independent when they leave the nest. Their parents still continue to feed them for about 12 days on average after they leave their nest. So you'll still be able to see them following their parents, begging for food. So that was just a short introduction about what starlings look like, what they eat, and where they nest. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about my research, which is on male song. And there are two main functions in birdsong. So one of them being to defend territory. So this is seen, for example, in red-winged blackbirds, where they sing to defend a certain territory where females would nest. And another function is to attract mates, whereas the song is directed towards the females. And in starlings, this is, I specifically studied the male song, as I mentioned, and starlings are known as open-ended learners. And there's not many bird species that are open-ended learners, and this means that they're able to change and add new song types as they age. And for my research, what I'm interested is looking at their age with respect to repertoire size, and that's basically the number of unique song types an individual would sing and the length of their song. So one way that I like to describe it is, for example, if your parents used to sing you nursery rhymes and they always sang Twinkle, 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 Little Star, wouldn't it be more impressive if they actually knew 5 other nursery rhymes, such as Itsy Bitsy Spider, Mary Had a Little Lamb, Hickory Dickory Dock. So that's kind of what I'm trying to look with repertoire size. How many types of song types do they sing? So how I look at this is by looking at a spectrogram. So I look at frequency, which is on the y-axis, and time on the x-axis. But it shows me the structure of the song types, and I look at them to classify how many types of songs they sing. And generally in starlings, they have 4 sections. It doesn't mean they would always sing all 4 sections, but it's a great way when you're out just to see if you can identify the sections when you hear a starling sing. So they start off with whistles, moving on to variable song types. So this is where they would have all sorts of sounds, and where they would incorporate mimicry of other bird species as well as inanimate objects. And this would be followed by rattle song types. And as the name implies, it sounds like rattles, where they make clicking sounds throughout the section of the song, along with making other sounds to compose the rattle song types. And they end with high frequency song types, and this is the loudest part of the song, and you can hear it quite a bit away, and it sounds like high-pitched screams. So I just wanted to share a song with you about how they would sound, and this song actually has all 4 sections.
Not hearing anything, Mashi.
Oh, really? Alex, are you able to hear the song? Oh, okay. Well, we'll try to send out a link through the chat maybe, or post it on the YouTube link for you to hear what a Starling song would sound like. But I'm not entirely sure why it's not working now. I'll try it one more time, and let me know if you can hear it. Can you hear it?
No, unfortunately.
Oh, that's okay. I'll try to send a link to the song so that maybe if you're interested, you can listen to it later. So another part of the song that I wanted to share was the mimicry. So these starlings, they're able to actually mimic other species and inanimate objects. And something cool that I found in my research was that 2 individuals actually were mimicking sirens, and they were 2 different types of sirens. And I was going to play it for you, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it, but I'll give it a try. Did you hear that?
Darn no.
Oh, okay. That's okay. I'll again try to maybe send a link to them if you're interested in hearing their mimicry as well. But I've just pointed out with the arrows where in their song they've incorporated the mimicry. So it's actually, I haven't identified, there's lots of different types of sirens, but I think it's either a police siren or an ambulance that they're mimicking in their song. And again, this is another individual. As part of my research, what we also do in the field is band these individuals so that we know when I'm out recording, I know which male I'm recording and that's their song. And we do this by giving them, so males get a yellow band on one of their legs along with a Canadian Wildlife Services band. And on the other leg, they get a unique color combination for the bands. And when I'm out, I know that if I see red, yellow, that it's that specific individual that I'm recording. And it's also really important when we're banding that we also collect their hackle feathers, and or this is also known as their throat feathers. And I've just shown this in the image here, where we use this to determine their age. And so this is a hackle feather under a dissecting microscope, and we measure the iridescence portion, which increases with age, and we're able to assign these males or adults, we use them to age females as well, to assign them to either second year, so they're either 2 years old, or after second year, so they're more than 2 years old. But my supervisor has been studying this population since 2007, so we have banded individuals from several years. So for example, if I was recording a male that was banded 3 years ago and I recorded their song today, I know that they're at least 3 years of age. So we're able to know their age a bit beyond the 2 categories of second year versus after second year. But that's part of how we determine their age along with their song. And So that's what I actually wanted to share with you today about starlings. I really hope that you find these birds just as fascinating as I do, and they're right in your backyard. So I hope you're able to observe their behavior and listen to their songs. And I'll try to send you a link of what their songs sound like and the sirens. But I'd be happy to take any questions now if you have any. That's actually a really good question. Complex song, maybe not that I know of right now. I know that starlings are sing very complex and they're able to mimic lots of different birds, but I'm actually gonna ask Colleen, do you know?
Well, as you said, Maheshi, starlings are open-ended learners, which means they keep adding to their song as they get older and older. So I can't think of any other open-ended learners here in Nova Scotia. So I would say most birds, like song sparrows and robins, they learn their song within a short period of window after they've left the nest. And then they babble it, and then they'll maybe sing it a few months later, and then that's their song for the rest of their life. Whereas starlings have a brain that allows them to keep learning throughout their life. And so their song repertoire size, or the number of nursery rhymes they know, gets bigger as they get older. So I can't think of any other species in Nova Scotia that can do that right now.
Yeah, I'm not able to. Yeah, I'm not able to think of any either. But yeah, thank you so much, Colleen, for that.
It's a good question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll have to look that up once I'm done. I think they would be using, when you say learning systems, just the mechanism of how they learn their stuff. Right. So the two categories, so as Colleen was mentioning, so there's two types of broad categories. So one is closed-ended learning, where an individual would be limited to a certain time period to learn. And then there's another, which is like starlings and also canaries that are able to learn as they age. So they would have two different mechanisms where they would have developed different they would have a different brain structures that would allow them to learn as open-ended learners versus closed-ended learners, but I'm not entirely sure of the specific details that would be behind those processes. And Colleen, would you have anything to add to that?
Not really, except that there's a very structured way to learn for species such as song sparrows that are close-ended learners. So it's probably about a month and a half after they fledged, they listen to other males, and we call those males tutors because they're tutoring the young males how to sing. And it could just be because they're singing naturally, but the little young males are listening carefully and absorbing those songs. And then there comes a time where the brain can't absorb anymore, so it shuts down. And then there's a quiet period called a crystallization, where the song is being processed in the brain by the male. And then the young male will start babbling, just like a toddler, putting pieces together. And then finally their song comes out, and they can, like something like a song sparrow, can have anywhere from 5 to 13 different song types. So that's quite different than Maheshi's study. She's finding some males have over 100 song types. So you can imagine the amount of work that Maheshi has done to try to identify all these song types. It would be easier to study song sparrows for sure, because they're close-ended learners and they don't have as many songs that they can sing, whereas starlings keep learning, so you can get in over 100 different types of songs.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, these are really good questions. I'm definitely taking notes to kind of look into it a bit more. Oh, no, I just want to say thank you so much for giving me the time to share my research and share this amazing bird that's often in your backyard. And I hope you're going to find them just as fascinating. And I'll try to send those songs and siren mimicry that I think is super cool so that you can listen to them. Thank you again. No, not at all. Yes, definitely. So actually in some of the songs that I've analyzed, they've often integrated crow calls into their song types, as well as blue jays. They call out mimic a lot of blue jay songs, and I know for certain that they are mimicking other species in our field site, because they often mimic what's around them or surrounding them. But I haven't gotten around to identifying what the calls are. But for sure, I've heard crows and blue jays. Thank you so much. Bye.
So should I start sharing my screen then? Also, thank you for the interesting presentation. I didn't know about starlings. I thought they were just like an invasive species, and I'm like, no, wait, they're kind of cool now. Like,
well, I'm glad that you think they're cool. Thank you for listening and having me.
Thank you. It was really interesting.
And good luck.
Oh, okay. I'm thinking, can you see? Okay, can you see like the main screen and not the presenter screen? Okay, perfect. Yeah, definitely. Oh, it's all urban forests. It's pretty broad. I talk about Halifax a bit more, but it's really just a broad overview. Okay, great, thanks. So hi everyone. My name is Hipa Charar, so I'm a nature interpreter at Shubenacadie Wildlife Park. So today I'll be talking about the urban forest, some of the benefits and challenges, and then I'm going to go over a little bit about how to ID some trees that you may come across while exploring the urban forest. All right, so just to get started, we're going to answer a pretty simple question. What is the urban forest? It is any tree in the city. So basically, what does that mean? Well, where do you find trees in the city? So they can be found on streets, on parks, like Point Pleasant Park or maybe the public gardens in Halifax. Trees can be found in backyards, along buildings like schools and hospitals. So trees are pretty much everywhere in the city. So in Halifax alone, there's about 438 parks. So together, all those trees, including the street trees and everything, they all make up the urban forest. So what are some benefits of the urban forest? So they provide fresh, healthy air by removing pollutants from the air. They cool the air, so they provide shade during the summer months. They help with flooding by reducing the amount of water that goes onto the streets through their canopy, and then they also take up water through their roots. They can even help fight climate change, so they take up carbon dioxide from the air, they store that carbon, they help prevent soil erosion. So that basically means they help soil from washing away, and that soil allows for more plants. Lastly, the urban forest is also home for wildlife and critters, such as the starlings that we just learned about right now. So can anyone, I know this isn't very interactive, but can anyone kind of spot the tree on the right? It's right there. So it's a great place for animals to live and to eat. My last point is that trees are fun. It's not the last benefit, but they make people happy, they're fun to climb. Generally, they're just great to spend time around. And I know with COVID, going outside, going for a walk is very helpful to enjoy the outdoors. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges of the urban forest next. So trees can face damage to their roots and canopy through construction. They can be vandalized or accidentally harmed, like hitting a tree with a lawnmower by accident. So if you look at the picture on the left, that actually shows a tree with some damage. So it was likely a lawnmower incident, but luckily trees are quite hardy, but consistent damage and stress to the tree can really affect its growth over time. Another challenge is infrastructure. So can you see a little bit where there might be a clash? So right at the top left there, there's a little bit of a clash between the tree and the utility pole. So this isn't good for the tree or the utility pole. So making sure there is space for both infrastructure, so the things that we need, and trees can be quite a challenge sometimes, but it's definitely doable. And then another challenge is the risk of bugs and diseases. So there are various bugs and diseases that can harm trees by affecting different parts of the tree, like the leaves, bark, or the wood. So the photo on the top left is the emerald ash borer. So that is a non-native invasive species that targets ash trees. And then the photo on the bottom left is the hemlock woolly adelgid. So that is an invasive beetle. Oh no, an invasive bug, sorry. More of like an aphid. It's quite small, so you can't really see it, but it is the hemlock woolly adelgid. So if you can kind of see those like white fluffy bits on it, so that's actually where it lays its eggs, and it can be quite damaging to trees. So both of these insects have actually been found in Nova Scotia. So proper care and things that you can do to kind of help prevent the spread is maybe, not moving firewood around if you're camping from county to county, or even if you ever come across the hemlock woolly adelgid, so those fluffy white scales, just make sure to wash your shoes after you walk the trail before going to a new one so you don't help spread the bugs. So that's one of the challenges. And then lastly, weather. So trees in the urban forest in particular, are at higher risk to weather due to the winds, because they aren't protected by other trees like in forests. They kind of are in a huddle. They'll just be one lone tree, and then high winds can really topple it over. So the picture on the left is in the public gardens in Halifax from Hurricane Juan in 2003. I don't know if anyone was alive then, but it really damaged the trees. A lot of the bigger trees toppled down, so weather can really affect the urban forest. what can you do to help with the urban forest? So it's pretty simple. Just get familiar with the trees. So getting familiar with the trees around your community helps make sure they are protected from harm and they stay healthy. So knowing what kind of tree grows around you and what condition they're in means you can spot if it's been damaged or dying or eaten by bugs or had a lawnmower incident. So this help reduces the challenges that trees face in the urban forest, and they keep the trees healthy. It's also fun to spot them. Like, do you see anything a little bit weird with the tree on the right? There's some old lights right at, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but right at the top there. So not only will you be helping the tree, but it's also kind of fun to look at the different unique features of trees in the urban forest. So let's get started with learning a little bit about how to ID some trees. So I can't see you guys, but if you want to list out some common tree species you can find in the forest, and then in the next slide you can see if you got some of them. You get any of them? Maybe you got different ones, and that's pretty great too. But there's so many common tree species in Nova Scotia, and with practice you can start to distinguish between them. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to go over how to ID trees and then a couple trees you might come across. Okay, so how to ID trees? So learning how to identify tree species can be a bit challenging. It's easy to get confused with the many species, but I did want to give some tips as to how to kind of make the process a bit easier. So one of the more obvious ways to ID trees is to look at the leaf. So making note of any toothed edges, or maybe if it's fuzzy, or if it's smooth or waxy, but just looking at the leaf alone can be a bit difficult sometimes, because some leaves look pretty generic. They just look like a very standard leaf. So other ways you can look at to help ID trees is by looking at the form and the size. So how does the tree look like from afar? Is it very fluffy, kind of like a white pine? Does it look more like a cone shape, like a spruce? You can look at the seeds. So this is a really great time actually to look at fruits and seeds of trees, because everything's blooming, everything's kind of out. So great time to look at those to help distinguish between the species. You can look at bark. So some trees have very unique bark. However, if you do want to look at bark, make sure to note whether the tree is old or young, because the bark will differ as the tree grows. You can look at the leaf or needle arrangement. So trees grow in different ways depending on their type. Some will kind of grow opposite each other, some will grow whorled around the stem, so that can help as well. Lastly, you want to look at the region, season, and location. So in terms of region, you want to see, where does this tree normally grow? So is it common to Nova Scotia? Is it native to Nova Scotia? Because if you're in a forest, it's probably a common native tree species, so that can help you kind of filter out all of the non-native species to kind of pinpoint what tree it is. However, if you find a street tree, it could be anything. In terms of season, the tree will look different as it grows. So as I mentioned before, fruit and seeds probably early spring, to late spring, early summer, even late summer. Like that season is really good for looking at the seeds and the fruit. But later in the fall, or maybe beginning of the summer, the leaves aren't even out, so you want to look at it through the buds or the bark. So there's different ways you can ID it depending on the season. Lastly, location. So where did you find this tree? So as mentioned before, if you found it on the street, probably could be anything, but if you found it in the middle of the forest, you kind of have a limited amount of species that it could be. All right, so moving on to actual trees. So there are a lot of different species of maple trees found in Nova Scotia, so I won't go into specifics at how to ID between the different kinds. However, I will say maple leaves are pretty recognizable, I think, due to them being on the flag of Canada. So if you see a leaf that looks like the one on the Canadian flag, it's probably a maple. However, if you want to really pinpoint whether it's a maple, you want to look at the seeds. So they all have a very similar shape, regardless of the type of maple that you might find. They're going to kind of look like the ones right on the right here. So kind of like two pods sitting right next to each other. And then they have little wings. And then the angle of the wings will differ, but they're usually that two pods, and the wings is a good way to figure out that it's a maple. And then we're going to move on to elm trees. So elm trees are very common street trees. So if you're walking downtown Halifax, and you're wondering what those really big, majestic street trees are, they're most likely elm. So the leaves themselves, if you look on the left and also in the middle, they can be quite confusing to ID alone. But if you see this kind of big to medium, large towering tree, and then you take a look at the leaves and they're kind of rough and hairy, and they're a little toothy and serrated at the edges, it's most likely an elm tree. And then as always, you want to be really specific. You can look at the seeds of the tree if they're around. So that's the one on the right here. So elm seeds kind of look a bit flat. So they're more of like one wing. And then there's one little seed in the middle. So if you kind of see some seeds that are kind of flat, one wing in the middle, probably an elm tree. And then you can kind of pinpoint it a little bit more specifically. All right, and then moving on to white birch. So this one's a pretty classic tree to spot. So if you remember, I was talking about pinpointing through bark. White birch, pretty good tree to be able to ID through the bark. It has very white peeling bark. The peeling part is very important. You kind of see how it is, well, peeling away from the tree. However, don't peel it. Don't peel the tree. It really hurts it. But it is a good way to ID it. Don't physically peel it, just look at it. But again, if you want to get a bit more specific, you're going to want to look at the leaves and the flowers. So the leaves, they kind of have this triangular shape. Sometimes they're not as pointy as the one on the slides, but they're more like, a triangle or an oval, kind of a heart, like an upside down heart shape. They're very toothy, so they have those serrated edges at the end. And then you have the flowers. So the flowers are called catkins. They kind of droop down from the tree. You can see them now. These photos were taken recently. Might be able to spot them. And then lastly, the size and the form of the tree is also good. So white birch tends to be quite small to medium, I would say, very slender. So you're probably not going to find a very large towering tree that's a white birch. That maybe, but probably not. Then moving on to red oak, a personal favorite of mine. It's a really lovely tree because it's a great wildlife tree. The acorns are food for many, many animals. The classic one being squirrels, but it's a really great wildlife tree. So a good way to identify red oak is actually by looking at the leaf itself. So though the leaves may vary in size, and I have kind of the pictures of how they might change throughout the season, they're all going to have a very unique oak shape. Specifically, red oak will have pointed edges. So if you see pointed edges, that's what kind of identifies it as a red oak. If you find one with rounded edges, it's probably not a red oak. Well, it's definitely not a red oak, but it's a different type of oak. Regardless of that, oak trees will always have acorns. So that's a really classic identifier of oak trees. Another cool thing about red oak is how they change throughout the season. So it's a good way to think about how trees change throughout the season. Like in spring, the leaves are going to be quite small and they kind of fan out and they turn this really bright red. So take a look at how it looks like throughout the seasons, and that kind of helps you with figuring out how to ID it. All right, and then moving on to conifers. So this tree can often be found in forests. White pines are very large. They're a really cool tree. They can grow up to be hundreds of years old, and it can often be found towering the tops of canopy. So it's a native tree species. So So you'll find it in forests, and it has fluffy, round, pointy needles. So they're usually arranged in bundles of 5. So you can kind of see it in the photos here. You'll see a little bit of a notch, and then you'll have the needles that kind of point out. Another characteristic of the needles is that they're rounded. So you can actually, if you take one of the needles, you kind of roll it around, it'll be able to roll quite easily. And that's a good way to identify if it's a pine. So size and form, needles, both good ways to look at white pine. And then you have spruce. So just like the maple tree, there are many different kinds of spruce in Nova Scotia. So I won't go into specifics of a certain type, but there are 2 good ways, just like with the pine, to identify spruce. So you have the size and the form and the needles. So the size and the form with spruce, they're very conical. So you can kind of see a very distinct shape, very pointy at the bottom, and then they get kind of a little bit wider at the base. With the needles, they're quite flat and short compared to something like the pine, and they grow around the stem. So you'll find them kind of covering the stem itself. Another cool thing is spruce tips. So right now there's a lot of new growth coming out for the spruce, and you can kind of see these little fresh new growths, and they're a fun thing to point out when you're going on a walk. Over time, later in the season, they'll kind of fan out and they'll look more like a normal spruce needle. But for now, they're a great way to ID trees and a little fun thing to pinpoint. And then I wanted to also talk a little bit about size and form because they're a good way to spot trees from afar. So can you kind of try identifying some of the different species? So this is a photo from Shubenacadie Park. If you look at the left there, it's a spruce. So you can kind of see that very distinct cone shape. But then if you take a look at the right, there's a white pine. So with white pines, even though they're kind of in the background, they're always quite towering and large. They'll kind of topple over the other trees. They're quite fluffy, and you can kind of see them pretty distinguished from other trees. So the next slide, and I'm sorry this isn't very interactive, but maybe in the question section, if someone got this mystery tree right, they can tell me. So there's a mystery tree. Can you guess this tree? This is a bit challenging since the leaves have yet to bloom fully. I took this photo recently, but the shape of the leaf is there, and I'll point it out. The reason I chose this tree is that it's a very unique and old species. So kind of think dinosaur age. So this tree hasn't lived that long, but the species has been alive for 200 million years. So around the dinosaur age, it's quite unique. It's not native to Nova Scotia, but it is found planted in around the city and probably in other, not just Halifax as well. You'll find it pretty much everywhere. So I hope one of you guys will be able to figure it out, but if not, it's a ginkgo tree. So they're really cool because there's no other species like it. So with other tree species like maple or spruce, you'll have a lot of different types. So there's sugar maple, there's red maple, Norway maple, but with ginkgo trees, it's just ginkgo trees. They're all alone. They're the only ones surviving. They're old. They're quite hardy too, so that's what makes them good street trees. So they withstand a lot of the challenges that trees in the urban forest go through. So it's a personal favorite of mine. I would say pretty cool tree. That's it for trees though, but I did want to speak a little bit about guides. So to identify trees, you'll need a pretty good tree ID book or guide, and there are a lot of online resources available. So the Department of Lands and Forestry has a great free online tree ID book you can use. It does only list out native species, so species that are common to Nova Scotia, but it is a great way to start learning how to ID, since it does go through, the bark and the leaves and the seeds. It's not just the leaf alone. And then if you wanted to look more for more information or more events, things like that, more webinars on land and wildlife education, the Natural Resource Education Center is a great place to check out. So even with COVID going on and the restrictions placed on, physically going there, they're quite active on social media. And it's a great place to learn more about our forests and trees if you're interested. Questions. Also wanted to know, if you have any questions that you don't want to ask right now, you can feel free to email me. If you ever need help with tree ID or anything like that, my email is right on the screen. Thanks for listening, everyone. Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really great question. You guys are asking really cool questions. So I would start out with trying to plant native tree species. So species in the Acadian forest. Those would be sugar maple, white pine, red oak, spruce, so probably red spruce, and then, oh, I'm blanking on the last one. Oh man, what is it? I think might be eastern hemlock or balsam fir, but I would probably not want to plant one of those. I would say it's tough to ask that question about climate change because a lot of the species range that we have will actually shift almost. So if you think of like the map of the world, you have Nova Scotia here, and then maybe you have like the eastern United States here, and then the trees that are well suited for the eastern United States will almost shift to kind of like, merge with the Nova Scotia trees. So maybe starting to look at trees that grow well a little bit southeast of us if you want trees that will grow in the long term, because their temperature range or their climate range, as the temperatures rise, will start to mimic kind of the ones like our climate will start to mimic the ones that are kind of like below us almost. So start thinking about that. But native tree species, I would say, are the best way to go. But also, be aware of invasive, this might get a bit too much, but be aware of invasive species too. So like, if you plant an ash tree, probably not a good idea because we have the emerald ash borer and that targets ash trees. So it's a couple different things, but I would say start with native tree species. Not necessarily. I would just say like it can be a bit overwhelming trying to like ID tree species and learning the different plants, but just starting with the basics, just trying to figure out, what's a pine, for example, long needles, long rounded needles, or, maple leaf, pretty characteristic. Starting simple, and just try not to get overwhelmed if you want to learn how to ID trees. Oh my God, these are really great questions. I don't know. I'm not sure about like its capability, but I would say, and this is just my personal opinion, I would say probably a white pine, only because it's a very long-lasting species and it grows really well. So in terms of size, it'll be able to store a lot of carbon. And in terms of the length of how long it lives, it'll be able to store carbon for a longer amount of time. This is not backed up by science, so this is just kind of my opinion. I would say it would be a white pine. No, I don't think it is. I can look it up for you if you want really quickly, but I don't think it is. No, it's not. Blue spruce. I think it's quite common to find blue spruce on streets, but I don't think it is. No, it's not. But other, like the common spruce that you'll find here in Nova Scotia would be red spruce, white spruce, and black spruce. So red spruce you'll probably find in forests. White spruce is very common in fields, so like agricultural fields. Black spruce is common in swamps. So I would say those are the three main spruce that you would find here. Blue spruce, I don't think so. No, maybe in streets.
The presentation looks like it's up on my screen in the stream, so I think I will just go ahead and start. So, welcome everybody to my presentation. I don't know why I welcomed you, but I will be talking today about mosses and lichens of Nova Scotia. So first off, what are mosses? Mosses are a type of plant, actually. So there are two main groups of plants. There are vascular plants, which are, when you think of a plant, you're probably thinking of a vascular plant. So it's any plant that has flowers, conifers, so like any tree is a vascular plant. Ferns are also vascular plants. And what a vascular plant is a plant that has something called vascular tissue. So vascular tissue is this sort of internal pipe system, and you can kind of see it in the photo on the right here, that allows water and minerals to travel up the stem and into the leaves and everywhere, and then sugars to travel everywhere within the plant. And then the non-vascular plants are what mosses are a part of, and they don't have this vascular tissue. So they don't have these pipes. The water has to be absorbed directly into the plant. So the water has to come in contact with the plant for it to get what it needs. water and minerals, I should say. So some characteristics of mosses are that they have no true leaves, stem, or roots, and this is because none of these structures have any vascular tissue in them. So botanists, so people who study plants, are very particular about the words that they use. So they call them different things, even though they basically look the same. They just don't have this vascular tissue. So as you can see, this moss at the bottom has leaf-like structures and a stem-like structure. And then in the top left, there are these root-like structures, but they're just not true versions of these structures. They are short, usually, because they don't have vascular tissue. They can't grow very tall. So if they were to grow tall, they wouldn't be able to get all the water and nutrients to the top of the plant, just because they would have nothing to carry it up there. So they have to stay short where they can absorb all the water. They must live in moist habitats, and this is because they're so small, they dry out really easily, and they need water to survive. They also don't have roots that are very long, and they can't absorb water. So unlike a vascular plant, which would be able to reach the water that's buried deep in the soil with its roots, mosses can't do that. So those are some reasons. There are more, but those are main ones. They also reproduce with spores rather than seeds. So in the middle top photo, you can see these sort of green grains on top of these capsules here, and these are the spores that they use to reproduce with. And lastly, of course, because they are plants, they photosynthesize, and if you don't know what photosynthesis is, it's basically a chemical reaction that plants do to feed themselves. So they use the energy of the sun and water and carbon dioxide to make themselves sugars to eat. All right, now we've discussed mosses. What are lichens? Lichens are not plants. They are a combination of a fungus and an algae. And this type of combination is called mutualism. So in mutualism, both of the organisms that live together benefit from living together. So it's kind of like, if you've heard of parasitism, it's a similar relationship to that, but instead of one of the organisms benefiting and the other one being harmed, they both benefit. So it's great for everybody. In the case of lichens, the fungus forms the structure of the lichen. So in this photo on the right, you can see that there's this clear area on the bottom and the top, and that is the fungus part. And then, so the fungus, because it forms the main body of the lichen, collects water and creates the structure. And then all these green circles that you see are the algae. So the algae produce food because they also photosynthesize just like plants do. So some characteristics of lichens, as I was mentioning, they also photosynthesize. They don't have any roots or leaves like mosses do, but they don't even have structures that sort of resemble them at all. So they have something called rhizines that are they're sort of like roots in that they hold them to whatever surface they're on, but they don't take up any water through like soil or anything like that. And then they don't have leaves, but they have a main body, which is called the thallus. So in this photo on the right, all of these like flat lobed areas would be called the thallus. Basically, everything you can see in this lichen is the thallus. They are usually short. They don't have the structural capabilities to grow very tall. Although they can, if they're a hanging lichen, they can grow quite long, just because they don't have to work against gravity. So if you're familiar with old man's beard lichens that you see sometimes in Nova Scotia, those can get quite long. Those are the ones that are, we'll discuss it later, but they're the sort of pale green ones that hang from tree branches. Yeah, that would be the only exception I can think of. They can live in dry areas, unlike mosses that typically have to be wet quite regularly. Lichens can dry out for, depending on the species. Some of them are very picky about being in wet habitats, but depending on the species, they can get dried out for long periods of time and not have any problem and just carry on. And also, like mosses, they reproduce with spores, and their spores come from these little circles that you see on this thallus here. They just disperse from there. So you're probably wondering, well, I know all these technical differences between lichens and mosses now. How do I tell them apart when I actually see them outside? So there are a few ways that I've highlighted today. Mosses are usually green when they're wet or dry. So on the photo on the left here, you can see on the bottom, this is a wet, this is the same species of moss on the top and bottom, but on the bottom it's wet and on the top it's dry. They are both, the top one is a little bit duller, but they're both obviously still green and colorful. And then on the right, we have the lichens. So lichens can be green when they're wet, but they're usually a dull grayish color when they're dry. So on the top, you see the same species on the bottom, but one's dry and one's wet. As well, lichens can be tons of different colors. They don't have to be green. They can, as you can see here, there's a huge spectrum of colors that they can be. Mosses, on the other hand, are usually, as I was saying, they're green, but they can be other plant-like colors. So red, brown, yellowish, any color that you would expect to see, like the leaf of a plant, of a vascular plant to be, that's basically what colors mosses can be. There is a little bit of a difference in texture. So because mosses are plants, they're usually quite soft and bendable, even when they're dry. So they can get a little bit prickly maybe when they're dry, or a little bit stiffer, but you'd usually be able to like press them down and they'll bounce back up, they won't break. And then on the other hand, lichens are sort of bendable and maybe a little bit rubbery when they're wet, but when they're dry, they're quite stiff, quite brittle, and quite hard. So that being said, if you find lichen while it's dry, or you suspect that it's lichen, just test it out gently because it can break quite easily. All right, the third difference that you can spot outside is in shape. So mosses, because they are plants, have very small stems and leaves, and they tend to look leafy and plant-like. So mosses can grow in two different ways. They can grow with their stems straight up, and you'll typically find them in this sort of round pin-cushiony look, or they can grow in more of a carpet shape where they sort of lie on top of each other and grow in these sort of like shingle patterns. On the other hand, lichens tend to grow in three typical body forms. So you can have lobes like this one at the bottom here, branches like this one on the left, or they can be completely flat and crust-like this one on the right here. So I thought we'd go through some IDs of lichens first, and then we will move on to the mosses. So this is just a legend. We're gonna skip past this because it's a lot to take in, but hopefully they'll be sort of intuitive once they're on screen. So the first lichen that I wanted to talk about is called the maritime sunburst lichen. It is an excellent lichen because it's so bright. It's this bright yellowish orange color all over the top. It tends to be quite lobed, so all these little sort of projections, these leafy-like projections, are considered lobes, and they tend to be quite flat and close to the surface, but they're not attached in a sort of crust like I was talking about before. The lobes tend to be flat and wideish, and they're rounded at the tips, and they often overlap. As you can see over here, this one is on top of this one underneath. And the lobes tend to be a little upturned. So at the tips here, you can see that it's facing towards the person taking the photo. They tend to grow in these circular shapes, and they're they're common to see in cities. They don't mind pollution. A lot of lichens are sensitive to air pollution. So the closer you get to the city, of course, there's a little bit more pollution. So these ones don't mind it at all. They'll grow anywhere. They grow on trees, so usually poplar and elm trees. And now after Heba's presentation, you'll all be able to identify an elm tree. They grow on rocks, and they grow on concrete, brick, whatever. They're not super picky. And they'll usually be somewhat close to the coast. Not necessarily, they can be like right next to the ocean, but they just tend to like climates like we have in Nova Scotia, where there's coast pretty much everywhere nearby. Next one we have is the blue felt lichen. And this one, I love it because it is Nova Scotia's provincial lichen. I'm not sure how many of you knew that we had a provincial lichen, but it's this one here. Unfortunately, it is also a species at risk in Canada. So this lichen in particular, if you see it, it's great if you can report it. We'll talk about how to report lichens in the next slide, but yeah, it would be great for knowing how well this lichen's doing to report it. But a little bit of its identification, so you know what you're looking at, is that it is also lobed, just like the last one. So see, it has these lobes here. It also generally grows in a circular shape. Sometimes it doesn't, because this one's not as clean looking as the maritime sunburst lichen. Sometimes the pieces of the lichen break off and they sort of look like little bits here and there, but generally it'll be in circles. It's also bluish colored when wet, part of why it gets its name, but then it will be sort of light gray when it's dry. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but in this close-up photo here, it should have these faint white lines that are projecting towards the lobe tips from the center of the lichen. You can kind of see one maybe above where my mouse is here. They are very faint, as I was saying, so you might have to be quite close up or have some magnifying device to see it. They have this thick, felty, darker blue-gray mat underneath, as you can see here, and this is how it gets its name. It also has these brownish red dots on top of it, and as I was saying before, that is where it produces its spores. And there are some similar looking lichens that have, they look basically the same, but the red dots have this really thick border around them. It'll be very obvious. These ones you won't see a border really unless you're really close to them. They grow on deciduous trees mostly. They love trees that have a lot of moss on them. Occasionally they're seen on mossy rocks, but I have personally never seen one on a rock, so it's very rare. They like to grow in humid locations that are sort of close to the coast, within 30 kilometers maybe, and they're primarily found in swamps, so you won't see them everywhere. They won't be near the city usually. They don't really like pollution at all. So if you're ever, they really love southwest Nova Scotia or the South Shore. So if you're ever there in a beautiful deciduous forest, they might also be there. So a way to report lichens, just as a brief intermission here to the IDs, or anything that you see, it can be any organism, is this app called iNaturalist. So you can either download it on your phone or your parents' phone, if you get their permission, of course. And it has a phone app option, or there's a website. So you basically take a photo of whatever you want to observe, and if you know what it is, you can type it in, or if you're not sure and you know that it's, let's say you know it's a lichen, but you don't know what kind of lichen it is, you can just say lichen, and it will put that as the identification, and somebody else who might be an expert in lichens can come in and identify it further for you. It's a great resource. It also will give suggestions automatically of what it thinks it is, so if you're not sure, that can be super helpful. Okay, back to the identifications. So we have fairy puke lichen, which is a very fun one. It has this sort of crust, it's a crust-like lichen, so it has this green thallus, sort of like a minty whitish green, that covers the ground that it's on, and it's sort of granular, but a big identifying feature for these ones are these mushroom-like reproductive structures that are on these stalks. They will always be pink on top with these sort of whitish stalks, and they're really great to find on disturbed soils along roadsides. Next one here is tree lungwort lichen. I love this one. You can find it pretty much anywhere that there is cleanish air, and it is one that people often mistake for a moss just because it's so bright green and it looks kind of leafy. This one will grow on tree trunks and branches that are usually deciduous trees, and rarely it'll grow on rock or wood. It tends to be, as I was saying, bright green when wet, but when it's dry, it can take on this sort of like tan to gray-green appearance. It'll always be pale underneath, though. One second here. Okay, we're back on. The shape is sort of leafy, as I was saying. It tends to be quite large and shaggy, and all the lobes will have this sort of ridged texture on it, which is why it gets its name lungwort, because it sort of looks like the texture of lungs, which is maybe a little gross, but that's why they named it that. The last lichen we have is called star-tipped reindeer lichen. It is Canada's national lichen. You also might not have known that we have a national lichen as well as a provincial lichen. This one is quite highly branched, so you can see there's a lot of branches in here, and it will form these round cloud-like tufts on the ground. There are other lichens, other reindeer lichens that are densely branched, and they will be present on the ground, but they don't really have these sort of tufty looks that are so super round like star-tipped reindeer lichen does. They have this, all the branches end in this sort of 4 or 5 pointed star shape, so I'm just going to circle it with my mouse so you can kind of see that there, and then they surround a hole. And this reindeer lichen tends to be pale yellowish green. A lot of reindeer lichens are maybe bluish gray or whiter, so that is also a good identifying feature for this one. This one tends to grow on sandy soils or rotting wood, or with moss in moist habitats. So this is a great one to see on the forest floor, or maybe in bogs sometimes. And this one also doesn't mind pollution, so you can see it in forested areas in cities sometimes. Okay, now onto the mosses. We have, the first one is big red stem moss, and this one is basically what the name says. It has these sort of, not hugely large because they're mosses, but relatively large, sort of shaggy, feather-like leaves that have this bright red stem. A lot of mosses take on this sort of feathery shape, but they don't tend to look quite as shaggy and messy as these ones. They grow in carpets on forest floors, and they can also be found in urban areas. And the leaves tend to be sort of green or yellow-green, as you can see in the photos here. The next one we have is peat moss, and this is actually a group of mosses, not just one single species. You might have also heard them called their scientific name, which is sphagnum. Fun fact about them is that they're arguably the longest moss because of when they're present in bogs, let's say, they start out at the level wherever the bog started growing, and then they sort of grow up together, and they can get meters deep because the floor of the bog will lift. I don't know if that is making much sense, but they sort of, because they can lean against each other and they're squished together, they sort of grow with the bog. The lower parts of these like meter deep shoots will be dead, which is why they're arguably the longest moss. It's only like the top few inches that are alive still, but that's still pretty cool. They can also hold a massive amount of water, so 16 to 26 times their dry weight when they're wet. So if you see sphagnum, it's fun to just like, even on a dry day, you might be able to squish it down and get some water running out of it because they're that good at holding water. They tend to have this star/button shaped appearance at the top, and they're often green, but they can be red or brown or shades in between. They love to grow, as I was saying, in bogs, fens, and swamps, or wet areas and forests. They really like wet areas. The next set of mosses I'll be talking about is also not one species. This is a genus of species as well. They're called the haircat mosses. They grow upright, and they have these spiky leaves that sort of feel prickly when they're dry, not as prickly as a cactus would, just like slightly tickly. They're also, if you look directly down upon them from the top, they're also star-shaped, just like the sphagnum, but they don't look quite as squishy. They look quite spiky and sharp. They also are always this dark green color. When they're alive, they can turn a little bit brown when they're dead, but when they're alive, they're this dark green color, and they grow almost anywhere. They like dry places, wet places, open sunny areas, or shaded areas like forests. They can grow in cities or in the middle of nowhere. They're really not picky. The next one that I'll talk about is called stair-step moss, and I love this moss, and I'll tell you why in a second. They have these sort of red stems that you can see, and then they have olive green to yellowish green leaves. And these leaves sort of form this feathery platform, or platforms, as you can see here on each stem. And because they sort of lean, it makes them look like a set of stairs, which is how they get their name. They tend to grow on forest floors, and they can also be found in urban forests. And my favorite thing about this moss is that they grow a new one of these platforms every year. So you can count how old each shoot is by counting the number of platforms. So if this one, let's pretend there's nothing below it. You can see 2 fronds here. So this shoot would be 2 years old. And the last thing I'll talk about is this moss called a pincushion moss. It tends to have this sort of pincushion shape, which is how it gets its name. It grows upright. The shoots grow upright together, and many mosses can grow in this particular pincushion shape, but the way you tell this one apart from other ones is that it has these whitish green leaves instead of just sort of regular green leaves like other ones would have. It will grow on forest floors, and it can grow in urban forests. And that's all I have for you today. Are there any questions? I think I saw some in the chat, so I will just head over to that. All right, so Mabel Jade says, are there any good mosses and lichen books that you recommend? I have an excellent, I'm not sure about moss books, but I have an excellent lichen book that I actually will go and grab so I can show it on screen for everybody. 1 second. Okay, bear with me. Okay, so I really like this book here. Oh, it's blurring my screen. 1 second. Maybe I'll put it in front of my face. Well, it's called Common Lichens of Northeastern North America, and it's written by two people who live in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes. And so all of the lichens that you find in here will be found in Nova Scotia, and it's a really great beginner guide to lichens. Okay, I finally got this blur off. So yeah, this is what it looks like, and I can write the name of it in the chat. It's also great because it's so small, it can be carried with you into the field wherever you go, and it doesn't really really weigh a lot like a lot of guides can. It won't have everything in here, but it's a great starting spot. Becky asks, what lichen is the squishiest? I love wet lichens. Are any not okay to touch because they might hurt them? We might hurt them, or they might hurt us. Probably, I would say the squishiest lichen would be sphagnum, just because it holds so much water. Are any not okay to touch? None that I know of in Nova Scotia. I really don't think any in Nova Scotia would hurt us. Are there any that are not okay for us to touch? I mean, I think if you like found a moss, it's ideal not to touch it unless you're like curious and trying to find out what it is, or yeah, like I wouldn't like rip a moss out of the ground for just for fun. But if you're like trying to find out what it is, it's generally okay to just like take a shoot or a few shoots. It probably won't be a rare species, especially if it's in urban areas. And yeah, I mean, I would as a learning opportunity, I think it would be okay to just like take a few shoots for just for your own knowledge. Are there any other questions that anybody else has? All right, I think we're approaching, or we're at time now, so I will, think I will end the stream here. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. This was very fun, and I hope you all enjoyed yourselves. And before I go, I'll just drop the name of that. Philip asks, how many different types do we have in Nova Scotia? I'm not sure, like, of mosses and lichens. I'm not sure, actually, off the top of my head. I know we have about 3,000 species of plants in general, so that would include vascular and non-vascular plants. I think the numbers of mosses are probably in the hundreds. And probably there's a good amount, there's definitely a good amount of lichens too. I couldn't say off the top of my head though. Sorry about that. But yeah, let me just drop this. Well, anybody else has any questions to add, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll drop the name of this book there as well. There we go. All right, well, I hope everybody has a great rest of their weekend. And it was great to chat with you. Bye, everybody.